One of the most important elements of any design is the type. In this movie, you and I are going to explore typography, what it is, and how it affects the designs that we're creating. So, exactly what is typography anyway? Well, the technical definition is that it's the art or procedure of setting type. But in layman's terms, when we talk about typography, we're talking about all of the subtle nuances and aspects of what you probably call a font. Here are some key terms that we need to know about when we talk about typography. They include fonts, leading, tracking and kerning, and hierarchy. All of these terms are things you need to keep in the back of your mind while you're using text in your layouts. First off, let's talk about fonts. A font is basically a different style of text. You probably use them every day. Things like Helvetica Bold, Times New Roman, and Courier, right? What you might not know is that each one of these fonts falls into one of three font categories, which we use to classify what types of fonts we're using at any given time. These categories are sans serif, which means the letters like T's and H's don't have those small tails on them. Serif, those are the ones with the tails. Check out the bottom of the letters here to see that little flare. That's a serif. And finally, monospaced, which is a very basic typeface where each letter occupies the same amount of physical space on the page. You'll oftentimes see things like computer code written in a monospaced font for better readability and translation. The next term we're going to explore is leading, which refers to the space between lines of text. This is also commonly referred to as line spacing in programs like Microsoft Word. You would see it like double or single spaced. With leading, you have two basic classifications: tight, which means the lines have very little space between them, and loose, which means there is more space than normal between each line. Generally, the tighter the leading, the less readable the text is, and the looser the leading, the more easily the text can be scanned and/or read. Neither one of these is bad necessarily, but you should probably shoot for something right in the middle to ensure maximum readability of your text. Tracking has some of the same principles as leading in that you'll be tightening or loosening it, but it refers to the space between characters across a line of text. As we can see here in this first example, the characters are way too close together, making it sort of hard to read. This next one is much better, and in fact, probably where I'd stop if I were setting this line of text. But some people do push the limits with tracking, like this, which I find to be a bit much, but in some cases it will work. It just depends on what you're trying to achieve. Kerning, on the other hand, refers to the distance between individual letters. You'll mostly see the need for this on letters like A's and W's and T's and Y's when they're close together in a word. Just look for the letters that look as though they're closer or farther away from the rest of the letters in the word. That'll indicate that you need to kern them. You want the kerning to look optically the same across all of the letters within certain design elements, especially when it comes to logos. Here in this example, look at the space between the A and the W, and then look at the dramatic difference it makes when I shift the letters ever so slightly over like that. That's the power of kerning. One little nudge can totally change your perception of a design. If you want a truly in-depth look at the foundations of typography, I'd recommend checking out Ina Salt's course, The Foundations of Typography, here at lynda.com. It'll give you all the info you need to create stunning type in your designs. Okay, our last principle is hierarchy. Basically, this means that you have a visual scale that all of your type adheres to throughout your document. So you'd have a different size and possibly different weight for things like headings or body copy. Here, I have several different headings, 1 through 4, and they follow a pretty basic scale that starts at 72 and goes down to 36. Fairly simple, but very effective. The easiest way to make all of these elements work together is to create something called a style guide for yourself. Basically, all you're going to do is pick 2 to 3 fonts you want to use for a project, but don't go overboard. Choose a color scheme that matches the company or the look and feel of the design, and then set a scale for each piece of the text you think you'll need. Write all this information down, and that becomes your style guide. All right, now that we have some of the basics of how type works out of the way, now let's take a look at why is it so important to graphic design. Well, simply put, typography helps you to clarify your message, whatever that might be, and the fonts and colors that you use can truly make or break the design that you're creating. Let's take a look at this example here. On the left, we have some text that's really hard to read. That pink background and that yellow text, not exactly working for me. On the right-hand side, we've got a really well-done font. It's a light text on a dark background. It's evenly spaced, well laid out. That's the kind of things that we're looking for. The one on the left, yeah, you might think it's pretty, but it's not very functional. Remember, type controls tonality and thus also influences emotions of the people looking at it. Just like in an email. Let's say, for instance, I was typing out an email and I wrote out a subject line that looked like this. This would be a pretty simple, straightforward email. Whereas here, when I type it in all caps and add the extra punctuation, I send a completely different message. The same is true for fonts. So let's say, for instance, you're creating an invitation to the company party. Using a font like this might be acceptable. A nice muted color for the text, a nice script font. But using a font like this and a color like that, not so much. Yeah, they both say the same thing, but the color and font sets a totally different tone with one versus the other, don't you think? Here are my basic rules for typography. First, the text should be easily read and fully scannable, which means your leading and kerning should be spot on. Fonts should match the mood of the piece. No monster fonts for wedding invitations. Create a font scheme and stick with it all throughout your design piece. And finally, you should limit the number of fonts you use so that the design is cohesive and not just random and messy. Remember, type isn't just words. It's imagery in and of itself. Take the time to think about it, plan it, and make your designs the best they can be.